They called him Charles the Well-Loved. And then later, when the laughter of the court turned to whispers, they called him Charles the Mad. But in truth, neither name captured what haunted him most. For Charles VI of France did not merely lose his mind. He lost the boundary between body and soul, between flesh and fragility. He believed, with the full gravity of a king and the terror of a man, that he was made of glass. It began, as most royal madnesses do, with a moment of brilliance. In his youth, Charles was handsome, eloquent, and idealistic. A king who dreamed of uniting France after decades of war and famine. He loved pageantry, poetry, the shimmering elegance of glasswork imported from Venice. The courtiers said that when he walked through the halls of the Louvre, he moved like light itself, delicate and luminous. None could have guessed that this admiration for glass would one day become the prison of his mind. The first crack appeared in the summer of 1392. Charles, only 24, led an army to Brittany to punish a rebellious duke. The air was thick with dust and pride. Somewhere along the forest road, a man dressed in rags stepped before his horse and shouted a single chilling phrase, "Do not go further, noble king, for you are betrayed." The man was seized, beaten, and dismissed as a lunatic. But the word struck Charles like an arrow to the brain. Hours later, under the blazing sun, he turned his sword against his own men, hacking, slashing, foaming at the mouth, until he was restrained. When he awoke days later, covered in sweat and blood, he remembered nothing. That was the day the kingdom cracked. From then on, the king's mind slipped in and out of coherence like a candle in the wind. He forgot his wife's name. He forgot he was king. He forgot his children, his coronation, the very weight of his crown. And yet amid this ruin, one conviction rooted itself with crystalline precision, that his body was made entirely of glass. He would sit for hours in his chambers, unmoving, refusing to be touched, whispering to the attendants that even a sudden breeze might shatter him. He ordered iron rods sewn into his garments to protect him from breaking. When he walked, it was with the fragile deliberation of a man crossing a field of mirrors. His physicians, medieval men of medicine steeped in humours and superstition, were baffled. They prescribed purges, bloodletting, and pilgrimages. They burned herbs, whispered prayers, and read to him from scripture. But Charles's terror deepened. "I am glass," he told them, "and if I fall, I will shatter into 1,000 pieces, and there will be no king left." To modern minds, it sounds absurd, the delusion of a fragile ego translated into literal fragility. But in the 15th century, the fear made sense in ways we have forgotten. Glass was then a wonder of the age, rare, expensive, and imbued with mystical significance. It was the material of both divine clarity and mortal peril, transparent like truth, yet breakable like the soul. Philosophers compared it to the human condition, beautiful, brittle, impossible to mend once fractured. And so when the King of France declared himself made of glass, his people understood in their bones that he was speaking not only of madness, but of something deeper, a terror shared by all who lived in a world forever on the verge of breaking. At court, the courtiers adapted to his delusion. They bowed from a distance, their faces frozen in careful sympathy. When he entered the room, they moved softly, like actors in a fragile dream. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, once proud and imperious, now became his cautious warden. She forbade anyone to approach him without warning, lest the sudden motion disturb his glass nature. Servants carried cushions to place before his chair, fearing a fall. Musicians were told to play softly, for loud notes might crack his majesty. One chronicler wrote that on cold mornings, Charles would gaze into the frost on his windows, tracing the patterns as though they were his own veins. "See," he whispered once, "how even the air freezes into glass." Another reported that when a courtier accidentally brushed against him, the king screamed in agony, believing a piece of his thigh had splintered. For hours he demanded the fragments be gathered from the floor, his attendants pretending to collect invisible shards in trembling hands. And yet, for all its tragedy, there was something achingly poetic about his madness. In an age of iron and fire, of wars and executions, Charles's delusion was a cry for fragility in a brutal world. He saw what others refused to see, that power, too, is made of glass. It can reflect glory, but it can also break without warning. Still, the kingdom could not afford a king afraid of touch. France needed a ruler, not a relic. So while Charles hid behind his curtains, trembling at the thought of breaking, the realm around him fell apart. His wife and brother fought for control of the regency. Burgundy and Armagnac tore the nation in two. The English, sensing weakness, invaded again. The 100 Years' War reignited, fueled not by swords, but by the shattering sound of a king's mind giving way. But within that shattered mind, there were moments, fleeting, luminous, when Charles spoke with the clarity of a prophet. "Do you not see," he once told a confessor, "all men are glass. They think themselves stone, but they are glass. The first blow, the first betrayal, and they are dust." To some, those words were proof of insanity. To others, they were revelation. Because perhaps, just perhaps, the Mad King saw something his sane courtiers never could. They said that in the dark hours of the night, when all torches in the Louvre had gone out, the King of France could be heard whispering to the walls. His voice was soft, trembling, echoing through corridors once filled with music and laughter. "Do not touch me," he murmured. "If I break, I will never be whole again." The attendants who stood vigil outside his chambers spoke of the same sound each night, a faint clinking, like glass vibrating on stone. Some said it was the king's teeth, chattering in terror. Others swore it was his body itself, trembling against the weight of its invisible fragility. Whatever it was, no one dared to open the door. By dawn, the king would emerge, pale and hollow-eyed, wrapped in layers of cloth stiffened with wire. His robes no longer shimmered with the opulence of a monarch, but rustled like the armor of a man fighting an unseen war. The courtiers bowed low and said nothing, for to question his delusion was to invite wrath, not from Charles, who could barely lift his hand, but from the factions surrounding him, each exploiting his madness to tighten their grip on France. The queen, Isabeau, moved like a shadow behind the throne. Her beauty had hardened into calculation. She knew her husband's condition was incurable, but she also knew that his madness granted her power. So she played the part of the devoted wife, soothing his fears in public, ruling in his name in private. She signed treaties, appointed ministers, even negotiated with England, all while whispering that it was for the king's peace of mind. But the king's peace was an illusion, as delicate and temporary as his imagined body. When the royal physicians failed to cure him, they turned to theology. The court chaplains declared his delusion to be divine punishment, a reflection of man's spiritual weakness. "The king believes he is glass," one wrote, "for the soul of Christendom itself has become transparent, beautiful in the light of God, but shattered by sin." So they prescribed faith instead of medicine. They brought relics and holy water. They made him sleep beside a saint's bone. They burned incense until the chambers choked with smoke, and chanted Latin prayers until dawn. None of it helped. Charles only grew thinner, quieter, more brittle, and yet the kingdom still required its ceremonies. So there came the day when the king was compelled to appear before his people, the Feast of Epiphany, 1405. Paris, bruised by famine and war, needed to see its monarch alive. The courtiers begged him to come forth to show strength. At first he refused. "If they press too close," he said, "I will shatter, I will scatter across the marble floor, and France will be left sweeping her king into a dustpan." But duty, or perhaps vanity, prevailed. They wrapped him in reinforced robes, fitted him with steel beneath the silk, and carried him through the halls like a relic. The court erupted in cautious applause. The king's face was pale as milk, but he smiled, trembling, waving to his subjects. The crowd shouted blessings, but he seemed not to hear. His eyes fixed instead on the sunlight streaming through a stained glass window, red, blue, gold. For a moment he froze. His lips parted, and tears filled his eyes. "Do you see it?" he whispered. "It is me. That is what I am." No one dared respond. He reached out toward the glass and stumbled. The courtiers gasped. A single hand darted forward to steady him, but he recoiled in horror, screaming, "Don't touch me!" His voice echoed through the vaulted chamber. "You will break me!" In that instant, something in the room broke. Not the king, but the illusion that France still had one. The courtiers exchanged fearful glances. The people saw not majesty, but madness. The feast continued, but the laughter was forced, hollow. The king retreated again into his chamber and refused to leave for weeks. The window, that radiant panel of glass, was covered with velvet drapes, as though the very sight of reflection had become unbearable. Meanwhile, the realm crumbled. In Paris, mobs rioted for bread. In Burgundy, the duke raised armies against the crown. The Armagnac faction, loyal to the queen's lover, seized what remained of the government. Even the church split between rival popes, each claiming to speak for God. The kingdom itself had become a mirror, cracked into 1,000 jagged reflections. And still, the king sat alone, whispering to his attendants, "They laugh at me because I believe I am glass. But is a man not glass? When love shatters, do we not bleed from invisible wounds? When faith breaks, do we not feel it cut?" His physicians called it delirium. His priests called it heresy. But perhaps it was prophecy. Because what Charles saw, what terrified him so deeply, was not madness at all, but truth. That power, faith, and even sanity are only as strong as the stories that hold them together. And when those stories crack, the world follows. Years later, chroniclers would write that the king's madness was an isolated sickness confined to one man's mind. But the truth is that the whole kingdom mirrored his fragility. When the king of France believed he might shatter, France itself began to splinter. And somewhere behind the curtained chamber, the queen whispered to her advisers, "As long as he believes he is glass, we may rule in his name." She smiled, and in the dim light her jeweled crown caught the fire of the torches, glittering like cut crystal. The line between madness and manipulation had never been thinner. As the years folded into each other like the brittle pages of a fading manuscript, the king's delusion became the rhythm of court life, not an affliction to be cured, but a ritual to be maintained. Servants walked barefoot across the marble corridors so that their footsteps would not startle him. They carried no swords, no trays of metal, no mirrors polished too brightly, for the gleam of reflection could send him into trembling fits. Even the dogs in the palace were forbidden to bark near his chambers. France, the kingdom that once shook the world with steel and faith, now whispered in fear of shattering its own king. The court physicians chronicled their efforts in trembling Latin. "The king's humor," wrote one, "is of such delicacy that his very essence has turned to glass. His nerves are thin as spun crystal, his heart like a vessel of light." Some suggested purging, others bleeding, others the inhalation of ground sapphires to harden his spirit. All failed. The delusion was impervious to reason. It was as though Charles had found a hidden truth inside his madness, one that none dared contradict. And so the glass king reigned in silence. He ordered that no one come too close, that courtiers bow from a distance, that his robes be lined with soft wool so his edges might not chip. When ambassadors visited from foreign lands, they whispered behind fans about the strange monarch of France who feared his own touch. But those who looked into his eyes too long saw not foolishness, but something infinitely more disturbing. A man aware of his fragility, trapped inside the knowledge that power had made him too visible, too transparent, too easily broken. There were moments when clarity pierced his haze. He would rise from his seat, trembling, and pace the hall with a haunted elegance. "Do you not see?" he murmured to his attendants. "We are all glass. The world is glass. The throne is a mirror that shows the cracks beneath the gold." Then he would sink back down, exhausted by his own insight, and whisper, "Be careful with me." The physicians took notes. The priests crossed themselves. The queen sent letters to Burgundy, securing her alliances while her husband vanished behind a curtain of fear. France endured, fractured, leaderless, divided between cousins and claimants, while the man who should have united it stared at his reflection and saw only the possibility of breaking. And then came the winter of 1408, when the court decided to move the king from Paris to Vincennes, hoping that the clear air and solitude might restore him, but the journey itself was perilous. Charles refused to ride a horse, convinced the motion would crack his spine. He demanded a special carriage lined with cushions, and even then screamed each time a wheel struck a stone. "Careful," he cried. "Do you wish to see your king in pieces?" The attendants wept as they carried him into the chateau, whispering prayers that the glass monarch would not shatter before their eyes. At Vincennes, the world outside continued its descent. The 100 Years' War smouldered on, peasants starved, nobles feuded, but within the king's private sanctuary, time stood still. The air smelled of wax and linen. Windows were shrouded in thick curtains to keep the light from striking too sharply. The only sound was the faint clicking of rosary beads and the king's own murmurs. Prayers, apologies, fragments of memory. It was there that one night, a young physician, too bold for his station, dared to speak truth. He approached the king's bedside and said softly, "Your Majesty, you are not glass. You are flesh and bone. The world cannot break you so easily." The king's eyes, blue and unblinking, fixed on him. For a long moment there was silence. Then Charles spoke, voice thin as wind through crystal. "You are wrong. It is not the body that breaks first. It is the heart." He dismissed the physician that very night. The boy was never seen again. Outside the royal chamber, France continued to fracture. Armagnacs and Burgundians slaughtered one another in the streets. English armies crept closer. The people whispered that their king's sickness was a curse, that as long as he believed himself made of glass, no blade could defend the realm. Yet still they prayed for him, because madness was easier to forgive than betrayal. In 1410, when his son was born, the future Charles VII, the court rejoiced. But the king did not come to see the child. He only asked, "Is he glass too?" The courtiers said no, of course not. But the question lingered. And as the boy grew, France continued its descent into a mirror maze of insanity and war. For every time the king faltered, another noble claimed to speak for him. His body might have been hidden, but his authority was the reflection that everyone still fought to possess. By 1415, when Henry V invaded at Agincourt, the French army was led not by a king, but by ghosts of his ambition. The nobles quarreled, the soldiers broke, and France, magnificent, proud, ancient, shattered just as her king had feared. And through it all, Charles sat behind his curtains, untouched, unbroken, but utterly transparent, a living metaphor for the fragility of power itself. In the silence of his chamber, he whispered one final truth to no one. Glass does not die. It only breaks into smaller pieces that still reflect the light. No one heard him, but perhaps in some cruel way, France did. The years dragged on like a penitent's chain, each link clinking softly against the memory of what had once been a kingdom. The king who thought himself made of glass aged not in the way other men did, not by wrinkles or failing strength, but by transparency. The older he grew, the less substance he seemed to have. The courtiers said he looked like smoke inside his own clothes, his skin pale to the point of translucence. When sunlight touched him, his veins glimmered faintly blue beneath the surface, as if the delusion had seeped into his flesh. He spoke little now, though sometimes his silence was more terrifying than his words. The attendants who remained, those who hadn't fled or been dismissed for moving too suddenly, reported strange occurrences. They claimed the king could sense motion in the air, that even the flutter of a curtain made him flinch. He insisted on sleeping surrounded by soft pillows. "To protect me from the world," he said. Every night before he closed his eyes, he demanded to hear the sound of glass tapping gently on wood. The court musicians obliged by striking goblets in a slow, mournful rhythm. "It comforts me," he murmured, "to know I am not alone." The queen no longer visited him. Isabeau had taken up residence in another palace. her beauty now a political instrument in the endless games of Burgundy and Orléans. She spoke of her husband as if he were already dead. "The king is unwell," she would say, and everyone understood the code. "The throne is empty, and I will fill it as I must." But beyond the walls of the Louvre and Vincennes, rumors of the king's fragility grew monstrous. Peasants whispered that the monarch's skin had turned to crystal, that he shattered once a month and was pieced back together by sorcery. Others claimed the priests of Notre Dame melted him in secret fires to rid him of sin, then reformed his shape like blown glass. In the taverns, they laughed. The king who thought he was glass, while France was turning to dust. Yet for all their laughter, the symbol endured. Artists began to paint him not as a madman, but as a divine relic. Fragile, radiant, tragic. The poets called him Le Roi de Verre, the Glass King, whose suffering reflected the fragility of human faith. They wrote that he could see through deceit because he was made of transparency, that his madness was a form of revelation. And perhaps in that way, Charles VI became the first modern soul, broken by the weight of self-awareness, cursed to see through everything, even himself. But truth was less kind. In 1418, Paris fell into chaos. The Burgundians stormed the city, slaughtering the Armagnac faction in the streets. Blood ran through the gutters, staining the cobblestones. The king, hidden within the Louvre, was told none of it. His attendants lied. They said the noise outside was thunder. He nodded faintly, whispering, "Be careful, the storm might crack the windows." When his guards came to move him, he refused to leave. "If I go out there," he said, "they will see the light pass through me. They will know I am hollow." So he stayed, a prisoner of his own transparency. By 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. France was to be handed to the English crown. The Queen and the Duke of Burgundy declared that the king, in his wisdom, approved the agreement. The seal of Charles VI was pressed onto the parchment, though his hand did not touch it. He was too fragile to hold the royal signet, they said. In the chronicles of England, they called him Charles the Mad. In the records of France, he was Charles Le Fol. But in the secret writings of his own attendants, he was called something far stranger. Charles de Verre, the transparent one. They wrote of his voice fading to a whisper, of the nights he stared into candlelight and said, "I can see my bones." He died in 1422, alone, in a room so dim that the servants entered holding candles like mourners at a tomb. His body lay still, unbroken, the face serene. Some swore they saw a faint gleam upon his skin, as though the light could not decide whether to touch him or pass through him. Outside, bells tolled. The kingdom mourned, though few could remember what kind of king he had been. The courtiers dressed his corpse in heavy silk to hide the thinness of his limbs, placed a crown upon his head, and sealed him in a coffin lined with lead, to make sure, they whispered, that he would not crack. At his funeral, the Archbishop of Reims spoke of divine mystery. "Our Lord, the King," he said, "was chosen by God to bear the weight of reflection, to show mankind its own frailty." The crowd wept, but in the back, an old physician muttered, "He was only too human." As the coffin was lowered into the crypt, a shaft of sunlight broke through the cathedral window and struck the lid. For a moment, the whole chamber shimmered, as if the light itself were bending to honor the fragile monarch. Then the shadow returned. Centuries later, philosophers would call it the glass delusion, a madness of intellect and spirit, found among scholars, nobles, and kings, those who bore too much thought, too much awareness of themselves. They would say it was not madness, but the natural consequence of too much reflection. And so the legend of Charles VI outlived the man, the transparent king of a fractured realm, whose mind cracked beneath the weight of his crown. They called him mad. But perhaps, in a world built on illusions, he was the only one who saw clearly enough to fear breaking.